Hello, everybody. Welcome to this afternoon panel on slavery, dissent, and reconciliation, Harvard Histories. This is an event that's jointly sponsored by the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy at the Kennedy School, the Office for the Arts at Harvard University, and the Hutchins Center for African and African American Research. My name is Tim McCarthy, and I'll be moderating the panel this afternoon. And I'm joined on stage today with my friends and colleagues, Sven Beckert from Harvard's History Department, who won the Bancroft Prize in History last week, Kellie Carter-Jackson, former colleague of mine here at Harvard, who now teaches at Hunter College in New York City, Salamishah Tillet, another former colleague who now teaches in the English department at the University of Pennsylvania, and Brian Knep, who is the artist whose installation work, Deep Wounds, is in the transept in Memorial Hall here right outside this theater. There will be a reception immediately following this panel and discussion for Deep Wounds with Brian and the rest of us, and we hope that you'll join us after this event. But now the discussion. Let me start by throwing a question out to all of you, and maybe we can just go down the line here, about what you think is at stake in these commemorations of the Civil War. So I referred to it as an interrogation, where we're at the 150th anniversary of the end of the American Civil War, and there's so many conversations that are going on in all sorts of quarters about the significance of the war, its history, how to make sense of it, the legacies that are still that we're still grappling with. What do you think is at stake in a 150th commemoration or interrogation of the war?
Right, I think a lot is at stake, and a lot that is of great contemporary relevance, political relevance, social relevance, economic relevance. And perhaps it's quite fitting to have that conversation in Memorial Hall, which after all was built to commemorate the Civil War. But I think today we would want to improve somewhat on the vision of the committee that was in charge of erecting this building, the Committee of 50, which was quite eager to focus in its telling of the history of the Civil War, to focus on the fact of the reuniting of the nation. But I think what is at stake, what is at stake in thinking about the Civil War and commemorating the Civil War should first and foremost be the institution of slavery and the abolition of slavery that was its most important result. I think thinking about the Civil War should remind us of the great importance that slavery had to this nation's history, the great political importance of slavery to all aspects of the nation's politics for its first 80 years, and also the very great economic importance that slavery had to the development of the United States. Then, of course, the Civil War should remind us that it took a war to get rid of the institution of slavery. Slave owners did not voluntarily give up their investment in slave labor, and indeed the fact that it took a war to get rid of the institution of slavery shows us how deeply entrenched the institution of slavery was, of course, in the slaveholding states of the South itself, but slavery certainly also had a lot of beneficiaries and also political supporters in the northern states of the Union, including at this very university, at Harvard University, where for a long time it was nearly impossible to debate openly the fate of slavery because the institution was so invested in not rocking the boat, politically speaking. And then I think the commemorating the Civil War also should remind us of how of a group of very courageous Americans, many who paid for with their lives to have getting rid of the institution of slavery, both the soldiers who came from the northern states, but also it should remind us of the incredible sacrifice of many recently freed people in the South who fought against the institution of slavery on the plantation, who ran away from their masters, who ran to Union lines, who supported intelligence to the Union Army, and eventually fought in the Union Army again to reunite the nation, but also to emancipate the enslaved workers of America. And then the Civil War should also, the commemoration of the Civil War should also remind us of the fact that not all promises of that struggle against slavery were becoming real. The economic inequalities that were a result of the Civil War, of slavery, were not really redressed in the aftermath of the Civil War. 40 acres and a mule did not happen. And then, of course, a huge wave of political repression descended upon African Americans again in the wake of the Civil War, and vicious racism and economic inequalities persisted to this day. And last but not least, I think we should also remember the international importance of the American Civil War, because the American Civil War was obviously a very important moment in the history of the United States, partly because it did lead to emancipation, but this was also the moment in which global capitalism for the first time did not, after the Civil War, did not rely anymore on the institution of slave labor by and large, but new systems of labor. So I think the American Civil War was also an important breaking point in the history of global capitalism and the world at large.
Great, thank you, Sven. Kellie?
Sure, I think that there's a lot at stake when we talk about the Civil War. So we're here sort of at the 150th anniversary of the ending of the Civil War. And oftentimes I tell my students, when you think about sort of memory is political. So what gets remembered, and most importantly, what gets forgotten is political. Du Bois has this great quote where he says, "There is no dream but deed, there is no deed but memory." The idea meaning that it's not sort of what you think up, but what you do. And ultimately, it's not what you do, but how people remember what you did. And so I think that when we approach this particular moment, especially in my classroom, I'm constantly getting students to think about voices that are not really being heard, or voices that are being heard, but their volume is low in terms of how we hear them. So I talk a lot about Black soldiers and their significance in the war and the contributions that they gave. I talk about the fact that Lincoln says we could not have won this war without Black soldiers. I talk about the importance of women fighting in the war as well, because we often push women and push African Americans to the periphery and don't really place them at the center where I think they belong in this discussion of the Civil War. So my project has been for a really long time sort of combating this single story, combating the idea of Lincoln as a sole liberator and not African Americans themselves or oppressed people themselves, sort of bringing about their own emancipation, bringing about their own freedom. I think those are really important attributes to talk about, and especially when we see these things sort of visually or play out in film, so with Lincoln or with 12 Years a Slave, the way that we remember slavery in the Civil War oftentimes is colored by what we've seen in film. So making sure that historians have a much louder voice in saying, okay, this is what really happened, this is what really is at stake, I think is crucial.
Mm-hmm. Salamishah.
Thank you both, and thank you, Tim, for inviting me to be here with you today. I mean, of course, I think it's really important to understand and contextualize how we remember the Civil War in our particular moment, and also the post-Civil War, like the reconciliation period, and also Reconstruction itself. Primarily because, you know, one, how we remember war has everything to do with how a nation in some ways is testing its best values and its worst practices at a moment of violence and real deep conflict. So, you know, the ways in which we can remember the Civil War kind of vary depending on what political ideology you want to espouse at a particular moment in history in American context. But I also think if we're thinking about the question of democracy and the kind of problematic of American democracy and the ways in which the nation does or does not continue to fulfill its legacy and fulfill its obligation, the Civil War, I think, gives us a really important kind of, template and blueprint about one, what kinds of bodies, what kinds of individuals we feel like are worthy of recognizing, what kind of narratives of democracy we value, and at the same time, where does the kind of exploitation of Black bodies and enslaved Africans fit into this big narrative of American democracy? And I always think about the kind of cottage industry of texts that come out right after the Civil War. I know that's something that you've been thinking about as well. And where did African Americans fit into that? Du Bois talks about 50 years out, there was such a deliberate attempt to erase the legacy of slavery from the legacy of the American Civil War. And that's part of the project of creating a narrative of American unity that's still excising and kind of exercising black labor as fundamental to how this nation gets constructed. So I think when we are thinking about memory, we're also thinking about its twin of amnesia or forgetting. And 150 years out, I think it's important to note that we have new narratives of slavery that are being integrated into the national memory at the same moment that we're actually, and this is something that's really interesting to me, fighting around what narratives of the civil rights movement we can integrate into the national fabric. So, thank you.
Oh, great. I'm so glad that we're talking about all this stuff. And I think I'm going to talk a little more personally about the, just using the Civil War as a way to think about our own relation to conflict, using it as a metaphor. So perhaps to look at what are some issues that come up when we talk about the Civil War. We talk about conflict, we talked about unresolved, about the stories that we tell and we reinforce and the stories that we forget. And how can we look at this in our own lives, to look at the people who are our coworkers, our fathers, sons, our daughters, and even within ourselves, the conflict with the shadows, say, the sides of yourself that you feel shame about. And maybe the Civil War can be used as a way to reflect on these a little bit more and find some movement within yourself, locally within the people that you deal with. And that somehow this, if you think about that idea of thinking globally and acting locally, this idea of sort of working within your own psychology, within your own spirituality, and finding ways to release some of the suffering might actually then lead to releasing of suffering on a more national level, some of the issues that the Civil War historically brings up. So I think that's more my take on what this commemoration can bring for some of us, as well as some of this amazing stuff that these guys are talking about.
Brian, I actually wanted to pick up on that because because Deep Wounds feels very personal and also has broad public implications, because this is an art installation, an artistic creation that actually requires us, each of us individually and as groups, to actually be part of the art. The project itself becomes undone and refashioned while we're in the midst of it. And I one of the things that struck me on Saturday night when I heard about the project for so long, and I actually walked across the transept, and the way that the wounds open up and you can begin to see names and see relations and so forth, felt very personal for me, and it was actually quite jarring to be implicated in a work of art in that way. And so I'm very interested in the way that you talked about the sort of personal dimensions of this. And could you talk a little bit more about Deep Wounds and the inspiration, and what you're intending for us to get out of it?
Well, I mean, just honestly, when I first came, it was 2006. I was not interested in the Civil War. It's not something that I came with here. I just fell in love with this building, and a lot of my work had been very abstract at that point. I'm very interested in mythology. I was going to do a piece about mythology, perhaps the Holy Trinity, something like that. And then I heard from Ray Traetti, who works there. He told me a lot about the building and this idea of the names not being there, and also it being this controversial thing that comes up every 10 to 20 years. If you look back in the archives, somebody will write to the Gazette or the Alumni Magazine, maybe it's time to recognize the Southerners, and there's a lot of emotions come up, heated emotions come up, and so that felt very relative to me. Also, it was George Bush had just won the election for the second time in 2004. There was a lot of anger, and this is Cambridge, liberal bubble in a liberal bubble, and
whatever do you mean, Brian? People wasn't the least bit angry about that.
People were furious, talking about violence, and if you look at the red states versus the blue states, and you overlap that on a map of North and South, it's just there's this direct correlation. It just felt like something I needed to talk about. I was also very personally going through some conflict at the time, where there was somebody in my life I was loving and hating at the same time, and it just grabbed me. It felt like the right thing to do. And so it did come out of that. There is a lot of personal, a lot of my work, there is this, people talk about this piece as being very political in some ways, brings up a lot of issues. I'm glad, it's great. But in some ways, when I work, it's very personal. It's really about something that affects me. And this faith almost that the more honest I can be with that, the more it will affect other people. But in the end, I am doing it for me. It's certainly a selfish element to it. And so you saying that actually makes me, I'm very happy that you saw some of that personal element. And the aspect of people walking on the piece, certainly, it's like through your actions, you have to uncover this. Right. The floor itself wants to cover itself. It's a algorithm based on how natural patterns form. And basically, it's trying to cover itself all the time. So if you're not on there, it will completely cover over all the names. And as soon as you walk across it, it bubbles up, it blisters and wounds. But when you leave, it tries to cover itself very quickly. So it really only happens when you're on there. And there's an interesting thing that happens. Some people don't notice it at all. Some people notice it. And also, it's very, one of the experiences you can have is that you are off to the side watching somebody else do it. And often that's the more powerful experience than actually being on it. So there are all these different ways to interact, which I think is...
Well, I found myself the other night actually doing exactly that, standing on the margins of the piece and watching what was happening when other people were walking across it, and actually having a certain amount of trepidation, not wanting to do it myself, wanting to watch, but knowing that I wasn't going to be implicated or part of the art unless I actually took the plunge and walked across it, which, as I said, had a jarring effect because I felt as if I were part of it. Yeah. And everyone sort of feels that way. And while you're a part of it, having these very different kinds of reactions, it's absolutely fascinating. It's funny too, about a month or so ago, I interviewed Susan Laurie Parks, who had her new play, Father Comes Home from the War, at the American Repertory Theater. And she, and I asked her the question about, sort of why a Civil War play. And she said, well, that's not about the Civil War. It's about an enslaved man who has to make a choice about whether or not to fight for the Confederacy with his master because he's promised him his freedom if he does. And it's all about freedom and choice and whether or not any of us ever have either. But one of the things I asked her is, so why a Civil War play? She said, it's not a Civil War play. This is about my father. My father was in the military when I was a kid, and my father was always going and coming to war. And that was how it began. It began because she wanted to tell a story that was deeply personal for her, that actually had nothing to do with slavery or the Civil War or the Confederacy or even freedom, but yet it became that as she wrote. So it's always striking to me whenever I interview artists, how oftentimes the art comes from these places of deep kind of personal passion, and then they become something or some things else as they emerge, which I find to be somewhat beautiful. So let's talk about another kind of art or architecture, Salamishah. You've written a book, Sites of Slavery, and have done a lot of work on how these locations can become politicized sites of memory and erasure and so forth. And Memorial Hall itself is a memorial. It's a site that has certain kinds of things included and certain kinds of things erased. And one of the things that I was struck by in thinking about its original charge, which you referenced earlier, Sven, is that this was meant to be a memorial to commemorate, to honor the Union dead, Harvard folks who fought for the Union. And so in that very vision, there are all of these things that are left out, right? There's the Harvard folks who fought for the Confederacy, which you mentioned, Brian, and has been a source of great controversy and contestation over the years, but also the abolitionist movement and the moment of emancipation, the promise of emancipation. That idea of Civil War memory is also excluded. So you have, on the one hand, the Confederacy and Confederates fighting to preserve a society or a way of life based on slavery is erased, and the abolitionist movement, which sought to eradicate slavery, is also erased from this building. And yet it does important political work. So how do you, Simi, you went here as a graduate student, you've written this brilliant book, Sites of Slavery. How do you think about this building or sites like this when you think about slavery, Civil War, freedom?
Yeah, no,
it's a small question.
It's small, but it's a really generative question. Yeah. I mean, personally, last time I was here, I was walking across the stage with like the crimson robe and being fully indoctrinated into being, a Harvard doctoral student, right? So that's my most recent memory of being in this space. But I guess, Marie Sturken wrote a book in the early 2000s, and the book is called Tangled Memories, and she looks at the debates that occurred around the creation of the Vietnam War Memorial in DC, and also the AIDS quotes. And so she's looking at these two kind of nationalizing projects and the stakes in having them being so foregrounded in what we think of as, our nation's capital, the kind of site of ultimate American power. And so what she argues in that book, and it really inspired the work that I've been doing around how we remember slavery, is that who, and I said this earlier, but who we remember in these nationalizing projects and these memorializing projects have a lot to do, or everything to do with what we define the community or the nation to be at that particular moment. So when we think about a place like this, it's not coincidental that the Union soldiers would be memorialized and mourned at a place like Harvard, a liberal, ostensibly constantly liberal site, or at least a place that's always reimagining and then reigniting its liberal ideology through particular formulations. So I think, of course, the Confederate soldiers or Southerners who may have attended here or have some connection to here would not be remembered at an institution even then that was trying to put forth this narrative. In some ways embodied it, in other ways really fell short. But I guess the other issue is, what does it mean to not remember African Americans, remember women at the moment in which we're trying to understand a national tragedy? And then how does that relate to the various lack of rights those communities continue to have after the Civil War itself? The two aren't not linked, they're kind of deeply linked. So, it's also like, we have memorializing projects either through an individual artist who's kind of reckoning or wrestle with what am I going to remember, how am I going to formally lay this memory out, or if you have kind of city or state or national projects, the debates about the memorializing itself, I think, are as important as what ends up being the final project, right? So oftentimes those debates come about because of financial resources or because of political agendas. And so, it's interesting to think about when they were constructing this, to look at it, and I'm sure like your students in some ways did that, what kind of debates, what kinds of conversations were they having when they were deciding to excise or include certain bodies and certain people? And then there's the afterlife, and this is kind of where my work comes in. There's these memorials are not simply about fixing the past in a certain moment, but creating a kind of legacy or genealogy, or at least afterlife or post-memory of these events and institutions and individuals for the future. So what does Memorial Hall function as for future generations, for post-Civil War Americans, and how does it then keep on recreating this really specific narrative of American democracy that I think the nation requires and needs and oftentimes uses to hold the constituents together. So with that, when you have this kind of narrative of American democracy that's constantly unfolding and that constantly needs to be reignited, it's really hard to hold the genocide of Native Americans and the enslavement of African Americans in tandem with this great narrative of American democracy. It makes it messy, it makes it tangled, it makes it contradictory, and it sometimes makes it deeply pessimistic. But I do think there are really interesting processes and projects that artists and historians and activists have really been using over the last decade or so to try to integrate the narrative of American democracy and American slavery. So the Whitney Museum, which I haven't attended yet, in Louisiana, is an attempt to kind of create a plantation museum that's really centering the point of view of enslaved African Americans. There's various projects in New York City around the burial grounds, or in Philadelphia, the President's House, where there are really hugely contested debates about how do you remember someone like George Washington and his enslaved African Americans who literally fled from him to get freedom for themselves. And so I think those debates are really important. I think an integration of slavery and freedom as a founding narrative and arguably, a constant kind of, ghost that haunts the nation is important for us today, because we're still wrestling with these questions of deeply embedded racial inequality and a narrative of American democracy.
I wanted to follow, go ahead.
Just to follow up, I very much agree with everything you had to say, but just to add, in a way, this building is the only physical reminder of the Civil War, and in some very weird and indirect way, we can read it also as a reminder of the institution of slavery. But in some ways, this is the only one, but in some ways it does the work of writing the history of slavery out of the nation's history and even out of the history of the American Civil War. So this, I think, is deeply problematic, though I agree historically it's interesting to understand why that was so. And then second, it also writes Harvard as an institution out of the history of slavery, because the very fact that quite a few Harvard graduates fought on the side of the Confederacy is one of many reminders that this institution actually was just as much implicated in the institution of slavery as itself as it was implicated in the abolition of the institution of slavery.
Good point.
Yeah. I wanted to, we're going to return to that in a second, but I wanted to follow up on something that you said, Salamishah, that relates, I think, to Brian's art. And this is the idea of, how does one get called into the kind of the interrogation that you're asking about, right? Because this is a building, a work of art, architectural creation that itself is a history, and it's a history that's filled with certain things and erases other things, but it's a history itself. And yet, so often, unlike Deep Wounds, where you are called into this art to be part of it, this is a building that people walk through every day without noticing any of these things. Right? I mean, the first time I was in this room, this very room, I was sitting over there in a lecture in Principles of Economics with Marty Feldstein. And the last thing on earth that I was thinking about at the time was slavery or the Civil War. I was thinking about how the hell I was going to be able to drop this dreadful class. Which I didn't. Thank God for John Kenneth Galbraith, who showed up to give a guest lecture shortly after the class started. But when I was in this hall, so often as an undergraduate, as a student, right now the students eat here, they drink downstairs, there's all these things they do in this room. And yet I would say that they don't spend a disproportionate amount of their time interrogating the sort of memory, history, legacies of the Civil War. And so are we then, as people who pass through, who sit here, who engage in this space, who enter into it, but don't enter into those debates and those legacies, are we, in a sense, also complicit in not acknowledging history and erasing it? And
I mean, I'll just answer and then but one, I mean, I think that's I don't know if you consciously, you were obviously trying to make it interactive and then show the ways in which individuals, by covering up or not covering up, are complicit in the ongoing forgetting of maybe slavery and of the violence of the Civil War itself. But I do think, even without knowing the history of like a kind of recognition of the Civil War in particular, and only or exclusively Union soldiers, there is a way in which like the architecture of this space creates a sense of like hallowed ground, right? So even if you're in an economics class where you're not excited about, that there's something about this space that makes you both fully Harvard and also tied to a past. Now the issue is, what past are you tied to, and how is it both the institution's job or even the ways in which we can think about re-inscribing different kind of memorial practices here? How does that make you an amnesiac? How does that make you part of this kind of national forgetting of America's founding in really, really pivotal ways that lead to ongoing exclusions of individuals and communities today? So like even these statues function in a particular way to indoctrinate all of us in a specific narrative of time and timelessness and antiquity that makes you feel like you're part of this university. At the same moment, you're not aware of who's being excluded from it. And I think that's what memorials can do. That's what their purpose in some ways is to create a narrative of the past and then have you, future citizen, either become part of that particular narrative or someone who's resistant to it once you're given knowledge and information.
Yeah, great. Kellie, I wanted to ask you a question about these various histories. We're talking about different kinds of histories that are colliding or separated in so many ways and forgotten or included. And one of the things that always strikes me is that historians of slavery often are not historians of abolitionism, and historians of abolitionism are often not historians of slavery. And yet there is, you talked, Sven, about how we're all implicated in slavery, and the North was deeply implicated in the institution, maybe in different ways, but still very much the same. But those histories are so implicated in one another. And I know you've done some great work on abolitionism, and you and I share a love for that movement and have spent some time thinking about it. Talk to me a little bit about how you see these narratives, these histories of slavery and abolition as being intertwined or compartmentalized, and what effect does that have on the way that we think about the war and its legacy?
Oh, for sure. So abolitionism is sort of my bread and butter. I love it. And when I'm telling students about it.
That's how we came to know each other, our mutual love for abolitionism.
Bread and butter, right? So it's interesting because a lot of times when and my work is specifically on Black abolitionists, and a lot of these abolitionists who were former slaves themselves, like Frederick Douglass, or like Henry Harlan Garnett, or Lewis Hayden, who have these really intense relationships with the institution of slavery, and then go on to be the leaders of the abolitionist movement and the leaders of the cities in which they live in, fighting against the fugitive slave law, fighting against all of these political tensions that really, in my opinion, accelerate the oncoming of the war. And I don't think we give the abolitionists, and in particular Black abolitionists, a great amount of credit in terms of how they facilitated the oncoming of this war. I mean, you've talked about this a lot in your work as well. I think the way that we've seen the abolitionist movement has been this false sort of white man struggle to end slavery, and that it sort of excluded women and Black men and women from this narrative of how we envision the end of slavery coming about. So when I'm talking to slavery, about slavery and about the abolitionist movement, I talk of them as a group that are imperative into bringing about this war and the violence that they sort of use to combat slavery. I mean, there's so many people who are talking about how slavery was born in violence. It starts in violence. It has to end in violence. And the abolitionists are very much a part of that framework. Not everybody's a Quaker. Not everybody's a pacifist. Not everyone is
John Brown said slavery is war.
Exactly. And so sort of changing the narrative of the story, or at least where you start the story, I think is really important, because oftentimes where you start a story and where you end a story is so political again. I think if you start the story of American history with the Pilgrims and the Great Thanksgiving and the Native Americans, and not sort of with Virginia and slavery and tobacco and sort of the real birth, I think, of American history, you have a completely different way of looking at American history. So when I start the story of slavery, and particularly the story of the Civil War, I don't just sort of start with the first shot at Fort Sumter, but you really have to go back and look at all of these groups of activists who are radically reimagining the way they think the country should be, and really calling the country to sort of live up to its principles of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness that no one has really enforced for all Americans. So I want to reorient the way people think about the Civil War in terms of the activists who are key in accelerating it.
Well, the other thing too that I want to sort of mention in addition to that, because you raise a really important point, that the Black abolitionists, right, who were really the first abolitionists, I mean, I've argued who were the first abolitionists. There are 3 Black newspapers that predate William Lloyd Garrison's Liberator in 1831. And so the early Black abolitionism was more radical. It was out in front in terms of advocating for racial equality, not just the immediate abolition of slavery. But one of the things I always remind my students about is that so many Black abolitionists, particularly those who have been enslaved, were Southerners. Right? And so Black abolitionists actually offer, this really interesting intersecting of identities, right, that allow us to bring together the histories of slavery and the histories of freedom, right, and the way in which they flee, they seek freedom, they're traversing boundaries, they're moving from one place to another. I mean, they're migrants in some ways, right? And so there is in the history of Black abolitionism, I think, a really interesting model for how to bring these histories together and how to do them in that way, and which is all the more reason why centering Black abolitionism in the narrative of the coming of the Civil War and the Civil War and Reconstruction, I think is crucial. It's all another thing to recommend it. Sven, I wanted to ask you, because you have been, initiated this project, this Harvard and Slavery project, which was a course and came up with some fascinating findings about Harvard's own relationship to slavery and the slave trade. And so I wanted to have you talk a little bit about what inspired that project, what was at stake in the project, what were the reactions to it, the findings. If you could talk a little bit about that, because it's a really remarkable initiative.
I would be happy to. But I just wanted to quickly follow up on what you just said. I think, once we begin to realize how central the institution of slavery was really to the nation's politics and especially to the nation's economy, I think you gain an even greater appreciation for the radicalism and the courage of abolitionists. And that also has something to do with the institution of Harvard University, because abolitionists at Harvard University did not have a particularly good stand. I mean, Charles Follen, who was a professor here, was let go because of his abolitionist beliefs, and the Harvard administration in the years before the Civil War was actually actively discouraging debates on slavery because they thought this was just too dangerous for the institution to engage in, because too many of the members of this institution were either Southerners directly invested in the institution of slavery and about to return to life on the Southern plantation after they left Harvard University with their degree. And then the university materially and ideologically and politically was also very much linked to the institution of slavery. So, but to answer your question quickly, as you remember, I think in approximately 2005, 2006, Ruth Simmons, who was then the president of Brown University, issued a report on Brown and slavery. And when I saw that report, I thought, maybe this is also an issue that is of relevance to Harvard University. I also was looking around for a way to teach our students core issues in American history by having them engage very, very local history, such as the history of Boston, or in this case, the history of Harvard University. And so I thought I can combine these two concerns and to teach a seminar at this university that would take the idea from Brown and would study the local history of how Harvard University is related historically to the institution of slavery. Very quickly, we found out that nobody had done that before. There was really no record of that. The literature, there is an ample literature on the history of Harvard University. All of it is nearly totally silent on this particular issue. But I think in the year 2007, I don't remember exactly the year, but I think it was in 2007, I advertised a seminar for our undergraduate students on Harvard and slavery. And for this seminar, unlike other seminars that I teach, only 4 students showed up, but they seemed to be highly motivated. We had no idea what we are going to find, if we are going to find anything, because there was no prior research that would guide us to understanding that particular relationship. But we read up on the kind of general literature on slavery, we read up on the history of Harvard University, we read up on the history of Massachusetts, and eventually the students went to the archives and to the libraries here at Harvard and also in Boston, and they began to research this particular history. I taught the seminar then 2 more times. In total, there were 32 students participating in these 3 incarnations of the seminar, and they found an amazing story. They found stories about presidents of Harvard University moving into Wadsworth House, which is still standing, with their slaves. They found stories of enslaved workers putting up buildings in Harvard College. They found the story of enslaved workers serving our students. They found stories of enormous wealth accumulated in the slave trade and the trade in slave-grown agricultural commodities that came as gifts to Harvard University. They found an enormous number of Southern students attending Harvard University, returning to a life of violent mastery on the plantation. They found evidence of the university suppressing debates on the issue of slavery. So this institution, and this is in some ways not surprising, because exactly for the reasons that we mentioned earlier, slavery was not just an institution that stamped the American South economically, politically, and culturally, but it stamped the nation as a whole, and thus a powerful institution, the oldest institution of higher education in this country, of course would be in some ways implicated in this history as well. So, in a way, just thinking about it for 2 minutes without knowing much about the actual history would lead you to that conclusion. But now we found all that evidence. We found then also evidence that even after emancipation, even after 1865, Harvard would still benefit from the continuation of slavery on the island of Cuba, eventually even inheriting a former slave plantation on Cuba. The largest sugar plantation on Cuba was owned by Harvard University, and Harvard, of course, playing also a significant role in the perpetuation and invention of scientific racism that would so much stamp the politics and culture of the second half of the 19th century and then into the 20th century. So this is really an amazing story that my students researched in the archives, and we know a lot, but there's probably much more to know, and hopefully we will be able to explore that in the future. So your question was, what was the institutional response to that? So at first there was, I think, a great conviction that this university played a significant role in the abolition of slavery, and many of its graduates died fighting against the institution of slavery, as memorialized in this hall. And the idea that somehow we also, were to be found on the other side of this struggle, and that we actually benefited from slavery, was quite alien. But then there was all of that evidence. And my students organized a little exhibit. They invited President Drew Faust to come to our class to listen to their research findings. And Drew Faust generously provided us with funds that allowed us to put together a booklet, which I actually have a few copies here. So if you want to pick up one after this event, I would be happy to give you one. We printed that. We sent it out all over the university to anybody with any kind of influence and power. We sent it to people in the larger Boston community. We sent it all over the world, actually. The response here at Harvard was nearly complete silence. There was just no response. And the only institution that somehow picked up on that story was the Harvard Crimson, which then proceeded to run, I think, 1 or 2 stories on some of our findings. But there was literally no institutional response except for President Faust supporting the publication of our research funding. We then put on a public event, which was during the Occupy Harvard moment. So we invite members of the larger Cambridge and Boston community to hear of our findings. But the campus at this point was completely locked up, so we had to meet outside of campus. But we had a couple of hundred people show up for this event, and there was enormous interest in the larger community. But again, no institutional response by the university. And that, of course, now comes back to this building and this question of memorialization. I mean, what consequences should we draw from what we now know of the implication of this institution in the institution of slavery and its ability to directly, materially benefit from the labor of enslaved workers in many, many different ways. The students couldn't really agree what should be done. Should we put up another memorial? Should we provide some kind of reparations? What is we could never agree on that. And it is indeed not an easy question to answer. But I think we all the students agreed on that we need to debate these things. We need to be aware of these things. In a way, if you enroll at Harvard University and you come here as a freshman, you should be confronted with that history. You should know about that history. When you come into this building, you should be learning about this history. You should know about this history. But so far, it doesn't seem to have happened.
I think part of it is what you're alluding to is that they had this major conference at Emory a couple of years ago on how universities have benefited from and been implicated in the legacy of slavery. And so I know when Brown did their major study, restitution or redress was taken off the table, right? So then therefore you could have a kind of rich engagement or rich study of the legacy of slavery and the way in which Brown University and even Providence really directly benefited from the slave trade. So I think what's hard about these conversations, and I told Tim this on Friday, I was at Princeton and there was this conference on the aftermath of slavery, and I was on a panel on reparations itself, right? And the ways in which, let's say, in a similar vein, when the CARICOM, the kind of Caribbean or Pan-Caribbean organization, recently put forth their 10-point plan on reparations, part of the pushback you get from England, let's say, is that they're so celebrating their own role in the abolition of the slave trade that it's forgetting how they were, the direct creators of the slave trade, right? So which memories are we going to hold on to? And then what's the impact of actually acknowledging that an institution financially benefits from slavery without having any form of redress or reparations or restitution, I think is always an issue. And it has everything, again, to do with the fact that slavery was so pivotal and constitutive to even a university like Harvard or the nation itself, and yet has never really reconciled itself with this dirty, horrible past. And so what do we, that's the fear. The silence is from, okay, well, if we acknowledge this, then there are all these other avenues of redress or a reconciliation that we actually have to pursue, as opposed to maybe just acting like this thing that these students did was great, it's historical, it's history, it's in the archive, and it's something that's supposed to be relegated to the past, as opposed to understanding how, to own a huge sugarcane plantation in Cuba means that the university was consistently financially benefiting into perpetuity, its wealth and its financial gain. So it's always complicated, and partly why I ended my book with a chapter on reparations, because I wanted to think through what's the outcome of these memorializing projects? Is it simply about overcoming amnesia, or are there ways of thinking about how you can actually address the structural inequalities that slavery continues to create in America today?
But part of the reason why I think we continue to struggle with this kind of recognition of the contradictions, right? Recognition of the tensions, is because so often our notions and claims about progress are linked to a kind of optimism about where we're going that requires us to downplay the ugliness of where we've come from and how that manifests itself in the contemporary moment. I remember when the national history standards were being debated in the 1990s, we were at Columbia University in graduate school, and Eric Foner was one of our advisors who was on TV on Crossfire debating Lynn Cheney, who was then something with the National Endowment for the Humanities. And there was a moment where Lynn Cheney said, and this was like graduate student, we all gathered together and watched it together. That was how much fun we had in graduate school. We were watching it, and Eric Foner, Lynn Cheney exclaims, "But Professor Foner, what could be more depressing to teach our school children than slavery?" And Foner, true to form, quipped back, "I can assure you, Mrs. Cheney, that slavery was far more depressing for the slaves than it is for our school children." And then they went to commercial. But there was something, she didn't have a response. But there's something about this desire to create a kind of optimistic history that I think is part of this, to create a narrative of progress that requires us, in a sense, to forget about these more depressing histories. And yet, the genuine progress, if we think about that within the framework of, say, something like truth and reconciliation, right? True reconciliation requires us to not forget, to actually walk right into the more depressing parts of the history. And I'm wondering if we can think about art. Brian, your work, architecture, this building, the histories that we all are trying to write as locations of truth and reconciliation, and whether or not that project is possible, if our work can be part of a truth and reconciliation project, and whether or not truth and reconciliation are ever possible, or if they're always going to be elusive, because the truth is the thing that opens the deep wounds that sometimes makes reconciliation a very, very difficult thing. And I think about this now, like the moment we're in right now, where we have our first black president, we're trying to wrestle with the legacies of the civil rights movement. We have a Black Lives Matter movement that's exploded and ignited conversations about race and new forms of racism that seem very ancient, and yet we're also commemorating and interrogating the American Civil War. There is a lot going on in America right now. And so how does the work that we all do in our different ways participate, or can the work that we do participate and a Truth and Reconciliation project.
One thing I would say is that maybe the narrative of truth just has to be more flexible, so that maybe back when the Civil War ended, they needed some narrative to bring the nation together that obscured other narratives, and that now we're saying that's not working. Right. You know, we need to open it up more. And so, you know, when you guys were all talking, I was thinking how we're much more aware these days about differing narratives, and how some are suppressed and some are emphasized, but it's almost like our memorials still have this carved in stone feel, both literally and symbolically, you know, and maybe we should start making memorials that are more flexible. And we could say, well, this is what it is now, but in 50 years, the emphasis might change. I'm wondering, almost from an architectural point of view, how that could be done. And so this building, you know, Sven, you were talking about how slavery is not here at all. That's a great thing. But how do you put that in this building now? Does it belong in this building or somewhere else? How do you change it? I'm not sure. And so that narrative that might have worked back in the the late 1800s, early 1900s isn't working now. I'm not sure. And maybe in 50 years, hopefully, there will be more racial equality, and maybe there'll be another narrative. Maybe women's voices will be something that needs to be talked about, or so. I'm not sure. I'm not sure what it'll be.
Yeah. Just go down there.
I was just thinking of Faulkner, which is, someone who in English departments we're all familiar with. But I was thinking about Sven's point and thinking about both like Sound and Fury and Absalom, and Quentin being the Southerner who comes to Harvard. So even without Harvard having a kind of acknowledging its historical record, it has been the work of novelists, right? To the way in which Faulkner shows how the past of slavery is haunting the South and haunting the nation, and you have this one character of Quentin who's in both of these novels, and he's a Harvard Southerner, right? So there's ways in which I think artists have been, for better, for worse, reconciling or wrestling with this question of slavery, freedom, nationhood, and Harvard itself. The other thing I was thinking about, because I spent so much time writing about and thinking about memorializing of slavery, and at the time, this is like, early 2000s, I was like, wow, it's so different than the civil rights movement. I mean, the civil rights movement has this triumphalist narrative. It's the corrective of slavery, right? Baldwin calls it the second great insurrection, using Foner's language about the kind of the finishing of the revolution itself. And now, though, it's almost like there's been this weird shift where we're beginning to really reconcile and wrestle with the legacy of slavery, and yet the civil rights movement, and again, seeing it as an unfinished movement, is up for debate. It's highly contested, and no one knows what to do with it. So it's interesting, just because now I'm like obsessed with the civil rights movement, to see what I thought was true about its memorializing practices now is kind of more similar to maybe how I thought slavery was understood and unrecognized in the state, and now we're having a shift because, again, these projects are so unfinished because we've never really dealt with them fully in the first place.
Yeah.
And it's weird that I feel like we live in a moment that's so paradoxical in that you have Barack Obama as our first Black president, and yet Black men and Black women are constantly under fire when we look at the Black Lives Matter movement. When we look at Eric Garner, we look at Mike Brown, and every single week it seems like there's another Black male or Black woman's face of someone who's been unarmed and someone who's been shot. And people have a very hard time sort of reconciling how do you have sort of this Black face in the highest space of power, and yet on the ground, Black people are so disempowered, so unempowered. And I think it's interesting because when you brought up Truth and Reconciliation, I was thinking how in South Africa they had their Truth and Reconciliation commissions. But in the United States, it's almost as though we love our amnesia, right? Like, or we want to reconcile, but we don't want the truth. That goes hand in hand with that. And I think there are a lot of Black Americans who would say, I don't need reconciliation, but please give me the truth. Give me the truth in sort of the criminal justice system. Give me the truth in terms of mass incarceration. Give me the truth in terms of the education that my children are getting. We much rather have the truth, and that if reconciliation comes as a response of that, that would be perfect. But you cannot have reconciliation without the truth, not true reconciliation. And I think that's been the tension of American history since the dawn of its birth, and that the fact that we cannot sort of come to grips at this horrible moment, these horrible acts that have happened, and how we heal from that as a nation and not forget it, because I think that that's sort of counterintuitive, the idea that you would have to forget something in order to move on. I think the only way that you really can bring about healing is to sort of deal with these hard facts of life. That's the only way you can keep from repeating it. I think the reason why we keep seeing these resurgence over and over again with either the Civil War, the Civil Rights Movement, or even now the Black Lives Matter movement is because we haven't dealt with it. And so when you haven't dealt with it, you can guarantee that it will come back again and again and again. So I'm always, I mean, my ultimate hope is to have both truth and reconciliation. But if pushed against the wall, give me truth any day of the week, because as the biblical saying goes, the truth will set you free.
I mean, I want to slightly disagree with one of the arguments that you just made, that maybe in 1870 we needed this particular form of remembrance. Certainly some people needed that particular form of remembrance, but other people were very much opposed to that and actually continued to remember the Civil War in very, very different ways, though they didn't have the power or resources to put up a building such as this. So I think that's a really important the difference. And obviously there's a constant struggle about how we remember certain things, and this struggle, I think you are also right, will continue. But I think, slavery is now 150 years in the past in the United States, so nobody alive today is implicated or directly personally responsible for that institution. I think after 150 years, we should be able as a nation to come to terms with this history and to understand the full truth of it, even if it's very, very unpleasant, even if it's kind of an ugly truth. But when we go, and I think historians have to play a very, very important role in that, because when we go to a doctor and we are sick, the doctor is going to tell us the truth, even if the truth is unpleasant. And I think the same professional responsibilities we have as historians, if that is the truth, if slavery was so central to the nation's history for so long, we shouldn't be concerned about the political implications of that. First and foremost, we should be concerned with the truth of that particular statement. But then, of course, that has implications, and it has implications to the contemporary days. For example, it does help us explain the tremendous inequalities of the world in which we live in today, both within the United States, but also globally. And that, of course, then in turn has, again, other implications that we need to face. And I think without facing that truth, we cannot really successfully solve any of these other problems.
I think it's so hard to act on what you know. I think a lot of people will get this knowledge, but being able to act upon what you know, what to do with that knowledge, no one wants to sort of deal with, okay, that makes me responsible, right? That makes me culpable when I realize how my ancestors may have played a role, or how my whiteness even plays a role in my own privilege. There is a response that I think most people don't want to deal with that response.
And I think there are different roles for scholars or historians to play, right? I was joking with Eric Foner when he was here earlier in February about that historians have a much more important public intellectual role than fact checkers for movies, right? Like every time a historical film comes out, we write an op-ed fact checking all the things that Steven Spielberg got wrong. And there's got to be a more important role for us to play. And one of the things I think, one role is to create works, whether they're artistic works or academic works or some other kind of work that educates people, and brings them into a space where they can understand these histories that they don't know, right? There's willful ignorance, and then there's coincidental ignorance. And there are a lot of people who just don't know the histories and need to be brought into that discussion. And then there are folks who are willful about it, right? And a recent example is when the state of Texas, the legislature in Texas, banned the teaching of slavery in textbooks, in high school history textbooks in Texas. And I'm thinking the profound irony of Texas, right, which was the territory acquired in the Mexican War, which was a war over the territorial expansion of the institution of slavery. Like, you can't teach the history of Texas, literally the origin of Texas, without teaching slavery, and yet there is this excising of it. And so I think that we have a role to play both in creating opportunities for a kind of public engagement with these hidden histories, but also I think we have a role to play in terms, not as fact checkers, but as calling outers, right, as checking people's willful ignorance whenever they are trying to erase the more difficult histories or the contradictions or those depressing narratives that Lynn Cheney was so concerned about, and calling that out, right, and refusing to allow those kinds of erasures or those kinds of willful disrememberings or unrememberings to occur.
also think,
yeah.
because thinking of the conversation about maybe a need for a particular group to remember things, and yet, with Memorial Day, and David Blight writes op-eds about this every year. And he's uncovered, and I didn't know the origins of Memorial Day, or at least understanding Memorial Day as being a kind of commemoration by formerly enslaved people to recognize their freedom. And then there's a turning point when it becomes only or almost about fallen soldiers. And so what I'm trying to say is that even at the time that these memorial practices are being instituted and constituted, there are always alternative memories and alternative models. And so thinking about maybe even integrating those practices, people always, enslaved or formerly enslaved people had different ways of imagining freedom and had different ways of imagining their own integration into the body politic that comes at odds with how the nation itself is eventually going to reconcile itself at their expense. But they were creating memorializing practices. And so I think maybe thinking about instituting maybe some of those practices as the work of historians or cultural critics, foregrounding those even more into our contemporary practices is a closer way of getting to a kind of some form of reconciliation that both acknowledges the messiness of the past and also acknowledging the agency of these individuals who were directly hurt, damaged, and subjugated because of slavery.
And art also has a role to play in that and bringing us into these conversations. I mean, part of the reason we're having such a robust conversation about slavery and civil rights right now is because of 12 Years a Slave and Selma. Right, because these two quite remarkable and provocative films by Black directors, right, that are calling us into a space to have these conversations again. Art can do that. Just this Saturday, it was here in this very room where the Harvard Glee Club and the Radcliffe Choral Society put on a concert, which was meant to sort of interrogate through music and spoken word and movement and all sorts of other media the unfinished work of the Civil War, and we were able to bring in historical documents, and the choirs were singing and refashioning different musical pieces, and they did a brilliant rendition of Martin Delaney's revision of Stephen Foster's minstrel songs. Right? I'm not sure that's ever been performed on stage. Certainly has not been performed on stage here. And there was something quite remarkable because everyone recognizes, oh, Susanna, won't you? And then realizing that, ooh, that's not the same lyrics, right? And then you look in your program and everybody was disrupted. It was this moment where folks were like, wait, that sounds like a familiar song, but that familiar song is really racist. But Martin Delaney, the Black nationalist and abolitionist, rewrote it, right? And there was a moment where one of the white members of the Glee Club was, I think that one of the conductors, got up and read the petition that white medical students sent to the medical faculty at Harvard Med School in 1850, encouraging the expulsion of Martin Delaney and two other Black students. And he was reading this incredibly racist white supremacist petition from 1850 while the Radcliffe Choral Society was humming Fair Harvard as an underscore, right? These moments of disruption where art can come together with history in a space like this that contests the space, right? That brings history to a present space in a way that's disruptive, in a way that's unconventional, in a way that's unsuspecting, in a way that's hard for us to just kind of warmly sing along to. We have to actually think, we have to interrogate, we have to be intentional. And I think that that's a role that art can play and that history can play when they're brought together in these spaces that we often just walk through without noticing.
I think it's very difficult to get people to change with facts. I think particularly deeply held beliefs and identity beliefs. I think it's emotions. I think you need to hit people at a more subconscious level.
Right.
And I think art can do that.
Yeah, right. I mean, Aristotle understood, right, that the art of rhetoric was logos, pathos, ethos, and pathos, right? I mean, emotion was part of it. Emotion is often the thing that brings you in and keeps you there and makes it stick, even though it's messy. So let's open it up for questions from the audience in the remaining time that we have here. I think there are two mics right here. And if you want to get up, if you could please offer your comment as a question and be as succinct as possible so that we can get as many contributions from the audience as possible. And if there's one particular person you'd like to ask the question of, feel free to do that, or if you want to just open it to the panel, great. And if you could identify yourself, that'd be great.
My name is Fred Meyer. I live a block away. A quick story that I'd like to get your reaction to. I was at an antique show, and stumbled on a book published in 1818 by Dr. Joseph Story, Jr., who was a medical doctor, and he privately printed it. And this is essentially what he said. Too many people are not looking at the other side. Yes, slavery is obviously wrong. The abolitionists who are speaking out are right. But the Southerners have a point too. Slavery is mentioned in the Constitution. It's treated as a property right. And is it really fair that we here in the North ask these property owners in the South to abandon their property without any compensation? And my suggestion is that we have a compromise. Why don't we, who are, after all, benefiting from slave labor products like cloth made from cotton grown in the South, why don't we have to pay a tariff, and we'll use the money from the tariff to gradually buy and free some slaves? Now, frankly, tears came to my eye when I read that, and I spent far more for that book than I ever anticipated I would when I entered the floor of the antique show. How unusual that is. We don't even see it today, where people can put aside moral criticism of others and look at the other side. So my question, and talking about beginning the story, I'd like to see someone do a history beginning in his two editions, privately printed, 1817 and 1818. Why weren't compromise suggestions ever heeded? I think one reason is people couldn't anticipate the deaths that would be involved. 3% of the American population died in the Civil War. And it's about 100 of us in this room. That would be equivalent to 3 of us not leaving. Now, given that sort of imperative, people are more willing to make compromises and pay money to those evil Southerners. But absent that, it didn't happen. Hope that's helpful.
Okay. Anyone want to?
I mean, I'm just very quickly. I mean, historically speaking, it was the South that seceded. The South left the Union in defense of the institution of slavery. So there was not much sign of compromise to be found on the side of the slaveholders. And then I think that you know, obviously this is what happened in Britain with abolition, that the slave owners were compensated for the loss of their enslaved workers. But I think that's you know, I think that's the wrong way to approach that question, because I think enslaving others as such is a crime against humanity, and I think there is no, you know, I think there's no claim to any kind of compensation for engaging in a crime against humanity.
Yeah. I'll add to that. I will say that attempts were made to make compromises with the South many times. If you even go back to the American Revolutionary War, the people in power said to Georgia and to South Carolina, if you will allow your slaves to fight in the Patriot cause, we will compensate you for your slaves. And then after the war is over, we'll free your slaves. And they said, absolutely not. We don't want our slaves freed at any cost. But I think on the flip side of that, we get so sort of caught up in the idea of compensating slave owners that the idea of compensating the people whose very labor was used in slavery, that never comes up. There's never a question of how do we compensate or give back pay to the enslaved themselves. And that's something that every time that topic comes up, and it usually comes up in the form of reparations, no one wants to touch on that question. But it's interesting. One of the things I ask my students a lot is, why is it that, you know, Europe compensated 20 million pounds to its planters, and only 20,000 pounds was invested in developing schools for newly freed slaves? So when you start to compare the drastic amounts of financial aid that's given to oppressors versus those who are oppressed, it's really quite terrifying.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Karen Clay, and my question really addresses your conversation around truth, because what I'm hearing is that you're talking about one truth, and I think there are many truths. And so how does this conversation actually capture the many truths that are out there around this conversation?
A term that I use in my book from the political scientist Roger Smith says complex truths. So he's writing about how the United States creates itself and coalesces the citizenry around civic myths or these grand narratives of like American democracy or 4th of July. I mean, there are all these rituals and practices that we use to kind of create this sense of like a whole nation. But what happens when you actually like take into account that there are complex and contradictory truths? And I think this is, and I'm on this side in a way of being, because I'm a cultural critic, and I think not to say that the artists get that, but that this has been primarily the space in which we've seen complex truths being able to flourish, exist, and then and people have been on the forefront of getting us to understand, this messy history of slavery and freedom alongside the historians. But I'm thinking of a novel like both, Toni Morrison's Beloved and then her novel A Mercy, right? So these are narratives about slavery. The second one being about the kind of birth of a racialized slavery, like right before America becomes this slave-holding republic, and then Beloved being about the way in which the lack of dealing with the past of slavery not only haunts those who were formerly enslaved, but really haunts the nation itself. And so I think, how do we then memorialize complex truths? Like how do we recognize, redress, and then memorialize complex truths? And I think probably it's usually through really kind of experimental formal practices. It's through what you've created, which is a kind of democratic and collaborative piece between the artist and the audience. That's how you get to it. But it's harder to then think about, political practices and policies that take into account complex truths and therefore create a kind of better American society. That's where it gets, where art becomes a kind of political strategy is oftentimes the challenge, I think.
Yeah. Yes.
Hi, my name is Rosalind Elder. Thank you for this conversation. It's really been wonderful to hear. I'm just disappointed that there's so few people in the audience to hear the conversation.
It's being live streamed, so millions of people are watching.
Well, that's excellent to know.
We're just all at home.
But a couple of comments, not really questions, but comments. One comment is, whose truth are we representing? Because the people that built Memorial Hall felt that this was their truth. This was their wealthy, Boston money that built this hall, and this is the truth that their, Shah was, a Boston sort of icon of Boston society, of Massachusetts society. So this was their truth. And the question really is, whose truth is being represented? And when the people whose truth needs to be represented, but they do not have the economic wherewithal to put that truth out there, then what is the responsibility of the government to make sure that truth is heard? And that's the thing that I have a real problem with in the whole discussion of slavery. I feel like the discussion really sort of, I really try to compare the discussion of slavery with the discussion of the Holocaust. And the discussion of the Holocaust, basically, W.B. Du Bois said, we're not going to forget the evil, because once you forget the evil, it will be repeated, as you mentioned earlier. And I think the thing about the Holocaust is that we're not going to forget that evil because, that community is not going to allow us to forget the evil. Now, the problem with slavery is that it's not just mass amnesia on the part of most Americans, it's sort of psychological amnesia on the part of America to sort of encourage African Americans to forget that history. And I think we as a people have chosen to forget that history because we take on the sort of the victim mentality. Oh, that was horrible, so it could not have happened to me, because if it happened to me, something must have been wrong with me. And I think once we release that something was wrong with me attitude and understand the truth, because you have to get to the truth. As you said, give me the truth. I'll decide whether I want to be reconciled with you or not after I get it or not. But, give me that truth first and foremost. And I think until this country decides to put that truth out there, it will be repeated over and over and over again. So, no, but thank you for the conversation.
Can I just, I agree with you that in a way, part of what it means to be American is to forget slavery, right? Part of what it means to be, so to become American, to be indoctrinated into American culture means, and that means in African Americans as well. But I also think it's actually African American activists and artists who've kept the conversation of slavery alive for this whole time. So even on one hand, it's this huge trauma it's seen as it's the ultimate site of degradation, the ultimate site of non-citizenship. So to forget slavery as an African American, it makes sense. It makes psychological sense, and it's also the way we've all been socialized. But at the same time, it really has been artists, activists, oral historians passing on these narratives of slavery and keeping this legacy alive. And I'm thinking particularly around Sally Hemings and Thomas Jefferson, just to use an example. Right. Jefferson historians, similar to like Harvard historians, have massive documents about Jefferson, right? There are all these ways in which one has to acknowledge his slave holding roots, but then forget about them at the same time. And the reason that we know that he had these deep contradictions, both in his personal life and then in his political life, is because the story was passed on from one generation to another generation about his relationship with Sally Hemings. So it was white abolitionists, but primarily African American. So I guess that's what I'm interested in, who's kept the story of slavery alive, who's kept the story of the way in which enslaved African Americans negotiated and navigated their experiences, has been African Americans, even though the majority of African Americans, in some ways, to be American has meant to forget slavery.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm glad you raised the issue of Jefferson, because I remember when we were back in graduate school, there was the big debate about Jefferson, about that he got debunked, right? There was the moment where the DNA test came out, and the books about Sally Hemings and Jefferson's relationships came.
And Gordon Reed's here.
You're right, and Gordon Reed, exactly. And so all that exploded in the 90s, right? And there were all these things, and there were so many. I remember there were people who would say, "I'm not going to teach Jefferson anymore." Right? Jefferson's been thoroughly debunked. And for me, I remember having this moment thinking, so it was either all or nothing. Either he was the great iconic founding father, or he was this horrible racist slaveholder, and you couldn't keep those things in your head at the same time. And I remember thinking, am I the only one who thinks Jefferson just got a whole lot more interesting, and therefore the nation got a whole lot more interesting? Like, this is something that, go right into that complexity, right? I mean, I always teach the draft, Jefferson's draft of the Declaration of Independence, where we're in the draft of the Declaration of Independence. If you've never seen it, the final grievance in the long list of grievances against the king is where Jefferson has a total meltdown, and what psychologists might call projection, basically blames the King of England for slavery and the slave trade. And he puts everything on the King of England. It's the final grievance. And the language is so much more aggressive and unhinged in that grievance than any of the rest of the draft. And so Adams and Franklin and other folks get a hold of this thing, and they're like, "What, Tom, you're having a meltdown here. We can't do this, right? We can't include this." Adams in particular was like, "They're going to crucify us on this, because if we acknowledge this and then say that it's England's fault, right, we're then going to be set up for claims of or criticisms of hypocrisy." So they edited it out. Nowhere in the Declaration of Independence, the founding sacred text of American democracy, is there mention of slavery, because they edit out that whole piece. And I always teach the draft, and students are always like, "Oh, wow, I never heard about this," because for me, that speaks to Jefferson's complexity, but also the politics of erasure, and what gets included and what gets excluded. At the very founding of the nation, says a lot about what we were going to do subsequently. Right? For me, that's a model of precisely what's wrong with the country, is that we're always sort of writing this stuff out, right, as a way to position ourselves in a particular way. And so Jefferson is a fascinating example in that regard, because he's all of those things, right? He's Whitman before Whitman, right? Do I contradict myself? Yeah, very well, then I contradict myself. I contain multitudes. I mean, Jefferson was the original Whitman in that way. Other questions? Yeah. Go ahead, Sven.
Just quickly to add to that, I think, why is it so difficult for us to come to terms with the history of slavery? I think it is, it has to do with contemporary inequalities for sure, but it also has something to do with the national narrative that we like to tell as a kind of story of the expansion of freedom. And somehow, once you start to see that slavery is actually quite at the center of it all for a long time, then it's, this story becomes much more complicated. And then, the notion of truth, I mean, I agree with you that there are multiple truths and that, this changes over time and we'll see things differently 30 or 40 years from now. But I still want to insist that some things are just true. So for example, that slavery matters to the development of the United States, I think it's just true, and I don't think we should say that's just one story, and somebody else tells another story and we agree with all of them.
So. That's a good point.
Fair enough. Yeah.
Amen. I had a little experience and then a couple of questions, one of which is sort of more factual and the other hypothetical.
Let's
try to
be
quick
succinct because
yes,
we're running out of time. Okay.
When I was watching the first episode of the Civil Wars, the Ken Burns documentary, afterwards I came walking into Memorial Hall, and the first thing that happened for me was the stone. The name Robert Gould Shaw jumped out at me, which I wasn't really that aware of was being there, but and Fort Wagner. Of course, at that time there were no African American students at Harvard, so their names aren't there. But I also another thing I noticed was the dates of the people who died at Gettysburg, and the dates were July 15th. And I realized that people were wounded at Gettysburg and then suffered for 2 weeks and then died, and that was quite moving to me. Also, a Buckminster Fuller is up there, and I think he's a relative. I would like to hear a little bit more about the legacy of slavery in terms of the benefit to Harvard. I came in a bit late, and I understand this was touched on, but I think Sven has done some work. A lot of students have done work on this, and does it raise the question in some, I'd love to get a copy, does it raise the question, in what way could reparations be seen as a relevant issue at institutions like Harvard? And the hypothetical is, and Eric Foner has brought this question back in his recent book, about the Fugitive Slave Act being important in the coming of the Civil War. There are people who would argue, and I'm one of them sort of, that if the northern states had refused to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act, there might have been a very different scenario. And we might not have had 600, we might have had an end to slavery, but by refusing to enforce the law rather than by having a war with seceding southern states.
Okay. That'll be the final question because we're running out of time, but any final thoughts to that question? Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, just the first of your questions. So yes, I guess before you came, I talked about the ways how Harvard, materially benefited from the labor of enslaved workers for a long time, for several centuries. And the question is, what are we going to do about it? I mean, we know other institutions have actually done something about it. So, for example, Brown University didn't just write a report, but they also created a center that's now dedicated to the study of slavery and injustice or something like that. And then they gave fellowships, I think, to African-American students. So the city of Nantes in France, which was a major place for the slave trade, just built a huge memorial to the abolition of slavery. We don't have anything like that in this country. And then, as was mentioned, the Caribbean nations are just suing France, the Netherlands, and Britain for all kinds of reparations, but with really with real money attached to these demands. So, I think we should have this discussion. I don't think we can resolve it right now and here.
Yeah. Final words.
I will say, and this actually kind of goes back to an earlier point that the two of you brought up, was about how art sort of plays a role in how we remember and find reconciliation. And then, Tim, you mentioned it as well with Selma and with 12 Years a Slave. I think that sort of going forward, one of the trends that I've been studying a lot is film and historical film. And I think someone had said one time that that film is Hollywood's form of apology, right? It's its best way of saying sorry, sort of on behalf of the nation. And I think of all of these films that come up, sometimes with anniversaries, and sometimes they're sorries. But sometimes I think that these films can be really provocative in ways of starting discussion and starting debates that we might not otherwise have had. So Selma comes out with the 50th anniversary of the March on Selma, but 12 Years a Slave is not really attached to any sort of known anniversary. But I like to see going forward, I feel like film is one of the things that we may not get everybody to read our books, but you can get everyone to go see a film for the most part. And I think it'll be one of the most provocative ways of sort of bridging the gap between history and between art and showing that there are really powerful, productive conversations that can be had if we start to see how these things can play out in the future.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'll just echo, I've talked a lot on this panel, but echo what everyone said. And yeah, I mean, I think it's anytime these conversations are had, and anytime you have the data to then generate conversations about where the university can move forward, where the town can move forward, where the nation can move forward, I think is really useful. Because again, to use like old Freudian language of repetition compulsion, like that's what we're talking about over and over, both the people who are trying to get certain memories integrated by writing into the newspaper, or by people who really, whose past, and it's our shared history. It's not simply the history of African Americans whose ancestors were formerly enslaved. It's America's property in that sense to reconcile and reckon with this past in order to create a much beautiful and more democratic future.
Well, I just keep striking me how a lot of the conversations we're having, I just keep bringing them down to a personal level in some ways, like how, these multiple ways of drawing narratives about conflicts, about various multiple selves. It happens on the national level and also at the individual level. And sometimes I feel like if we can understand how it plays out in our own lives, that might help us understand how to play it out on a national level. Mm-hmm. It's very complex, but also a little trick I wanted to tell everybody that, not a trick, but a little secret. Mary Todd's brother went to Harvard and fought for the Confederacy, and if you happen to be on the piece, one of the names there, it says brother-in-law, and if you could find that one, that's Abraham Lincoln's brother-in-law.
Wow. Oh, wow.
That's
Wow.
cool.
Well, speaking of that, there will be a reception immediately following this session with Brian and the rest of us out in the transept where Deep Wounds has been installed. I just really want to thank the Carr Center and the Hutchins Center and the Office for the Arts for putting on today's program, and thank my friends and colleagues. It's been fun. Sven Beckert, Kellie Carter-Jackson, Salamishah, Tillet, and Brian Knep. It's been wonderful. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you, guys.
Take care.
Thank you all. Thank you, Tim.